So, you're with Julian on the Browno and a review of Godzilla X Kong, The New Empire. I hate these kinds of titles. I really do. Title, colon, subtitle, and The New Empire is so generic and bland. So, I've been a big supporter of the American version of the Godzilla franchise, even though it's been trashed. Overall, it's been a very successful affair. I mean, the initial film, I do think it's one of the most artistically beautiful visually out of all of the superheroes slash comic books slash monsterish movies, supernatural movies that cost $200 million to make. It was a very long film, and they did the dumbest thing ever in killing Bryan Cranston's character off, because the films desperately struggled when it came to the human side of the equation. I gave a 0 out of 10 to Skull Island, which was the introduction of King Kong to the mix. So King Kong and Godzilla. So Godzilla's I did a review of the superb Godzilla Minus One last week and mentioned it was the longest running film franchise in the world, something like 35 films, and mostly in Japan, and including in the modern era, parallel with the American Godzilla films. They're not allowed to release a Godzilla film in the same year the Americans do, and none of the Japanese films have been as prominent as Godzilla Minus One. So this is the closest they've ever been neck and neck. And obviously Godzilla Minus One has got astonishing and deserved acclaim, whereas this one's got, again, pretty trashed. But I think overall they've done really well. I thought King of the Monsters, the third film, was superb, even though the human side of it was terrible again. The whole King Ghidorah side of it and the multiple monsters and the visual design was magnificent. And then we came to Godzilla vs. Kong, and it was a surprising triumph, I thought, where Godzilla and Kong initially fought and then banded together against Mechagodzilla. I thought it was fantastic. Again, the human angle wasn't very well defined. Interesting this time around who they've kept. So we've got a new one, Godzilla vs. Kong, and they haven't really kept any of the humans, which is a very interesting thing. I think it was Alexander Skarsgård. I thought he was really good in the last film. I don't know why they didn't carry him over, but more interesting is they tried to introduce teenagers to the mix through having Millie Bobby Brown's character, her friend, and the Brian Tyree Henry adult that accompanied them on a side quest, which many people pointed out didn't have any impact on the story. And was wasted time. I don't agree that it didn't have any impact on the story, but it did feel like it wasn't really connected with the rest of the story. It's interesting they've ditched such a big star as Millie Bobby Brown and instead kept Brian Tyree Henry, which I thought was interesting, and also that they got rid of who Alexander Skarsgård looked like he was. I think is it Alexander? I lose track of which Skarsgård is which. Looked like he was going to be the male lead, and they've done a straight swap with Dan Stevens. And it's a real straight swap as well. It's quite bizarre. I'm not sure what's gone on with the casting. So it's only Brian Tyree Henry and Rebecca Hall, who was the female lead last time out. I've always loved her as an actress. She's also always got this sort of appealing vibe, and they've carried on with her and her daughter, who is it Kaylee Hottle? So she's in real life a deaf actress, but she played a deaf child in the last film as well, but who could communicate with sign language to King Kong. So that wasn't a bad plot element, actually. This time around, I don't think it's as bad as critics are slamming it for, and it's been very successful, actually. It might even be the most financially successful by the end of its run of all of the American Godzilla films. So it's up to $563 million last weekend. So it could be quite a big box office hit in an era where everything fails. If you think of films like the Marvel films often getting $200 million or less nowadays, it's been deemed a success. Story-wise, this time around, I don't think it's as strong as some of the others. So it feels quite generic in a lot of ways. Not that they're not all generic films, but King Kong discovers that there is more to... So King Kong is living in Middle Earth. So if you go into the center of the Earth, there's this upside-down world where gravity is all screwed around, and that's where King Kong is from, and he roams this land looking for remnants of his civilization. He's the last one left, and he actually finds it this time. And he finds that there are apes, and this is a huge, like it might be paying homage to Planet of the Apes, and at exactly the right time as a new Planet of the Apes film is just out. But it does feel like it's actually more ripping it off. So he discovers that there are a group of apes like him that are being imprisoned and forced to work in servitude by Scar. Not a great name, to be honest, because it's such a character that is analogous to Planet of the Apes. It's a bit too much. Who is the baddie, and he is someone that seeks to reach the surface where he can wreak havoc on the world. So he's the main antagonist of the film, and it's not as interesting setup as before. The caveat is that Scar is about the same size as Godzilla, but has a monster imprisoned with some like artifact he's got that can control this Godzilla-style monster, but instead of breathing fire or power beams, this one breathes ice. So he can apparently turn cities to ice, and that's it. So it's basically around stopping these two reaching the surface and wreaking havoc, and Scar trying to take over the world. But a lot of that feels really generic. It feels like, cut and paste from the Planet of the Apes era films, the first trio of those films, without too much in the way of addition. I thought that one of the biggest problems with this film is in the first film, the scale of Godzilla was so artistically rendered. And they carried that on quite well in the other films. You'd see this foot come in for scale, and everything was, gigantic. But this time around, the two antagonists, which is the Ice Godzilla and the King Kong Scar character, they seem really small. They did like there's it's like a law of diminishing returns, because they seem like they're virtually exactly the same size. I think they're exactly the same size as their counterparts, and it's shown early on that Godzilla can beat Scar on his own. So they aren't that terrifying as villains, and you just think, well, there's not really any stakes because you know that they're going to lose. But at least with King Ghidorah and with Mechagodzilla and the initial Kong film, there was these, the notion that they were fighting villains that could potentially beat them. This time around, I felt that everyone was quite small. All of the monster characters were quite small and quite... They're almost like when you play a video game and you choose the character, but you can choose it in a dark skin. It's like they were so analogous to the original pairing of King and Godzilla and King Kong. It just didn't seem like there was enough distance or enough danger from them to warrant much. We find out, that the deaf girl has her people, of whom she is the last of. So she's analogous with King Kong. He's the last of his kind. She's the last of her kind. She's not. Her people are living in this center of the world, Middle Earth realm. So she connects back with her own people. Overall, though, I enjoyed it. I did enjoy it. It wasn't as striking as the last film. It wasn't as interesting as King of the Monsters with regards to the visual design and the use of updating that initial Japanese aesthetic to a modern $150 million budget and doing it really, really well. And the guy called Junkie XL, aka Tom Holkenberg, electronic music producer, does the soundtrack again. It's just a little bit less interesting on every level. Rebecca Hall is fine, but the human interest side of things here is next to zero, and that I thought they'd started to get somewhere with Rebecca Hall and Alexander Skarsgård last time out, but they keep ditching all the human characters as though none of them are really that important. So it's only really her and her daughter that carry on from the last film, and Bernie just does his wisecracking routine. Ryan Tyree Henry as Bernie does his wisecracking routine again, which is amiable enough. Visually, it's pretty stunning. But like I said, when the scale of the monsters was so shocking in the other films, that's gone a bit here, I felt. And if you're going to introduce, the biggest element you can introduce is the new monster they're fighting, to have virtual carbon copies of the current antagonists as the current carbon copies of the protagonists as the antagonists is a little bit reductive. So overall, I enjoyed it. It's not too long. It doesn't hang around too long. It's a fairly enjoyable breeze, and there's lots of good fighting and battles and stuff going on. It's not quite headache-inducing just yet, but I feel like it's sort of coming, that it's going to be. And I feel like if they do any more, they really need to up their game, because on every level, Godzilla Minus One wiped the floor with it, and particularly with the development of human characters, which it was so much better at. So the next one has to be more visually interesting, has to have more interesting monsters, and has to have better humans, really. But I still liked it. I was going to give Godzilla and Kong, The New Empire, I'm a fan of them, so a 7.5 out of 10.